Hi, everyone. For this lecture, we're going to discuss cardiovascular program design characteristics. For this lecture, we're going to talk about 5 steps to program design. First of all, selecting an exercise mode, discussing training frequency, training intensity, exercise duration, and exercise progression. Firstly, let's discuss exercise mode. And everyone has their preference. It's usually one or two cardiovascular modes that you enjoy doing. It could be the elliptical, it could be running, it could be walking, it could be biking, it could be rollerblading. There's lots of different options. Even when I was a professional cyclist and I was training 25 hours a week on my bike, I would ensure I ran once a week just to impact my bones well and provide a different cardiovascular stimulus to my body to ensure I was more complete. I enjoyed doing this and I felt like it kept me well rounded. So, participation in multiple aerobic endurance activities is warranted, especially in the off season for athletes, to provide some variety. And this mostly helps from a psychological perspective to get them outside the field of play and have some variety in the off season as well as in the. It just gives you some psychological rest from actually training in the mode of training you're constantly doing. For a general population, it is good to provide variety, as some people like this, and it actually enhances their adherence to the exercise plan, while others may like a sole exercise mode. And that's what you need to discuss in your pre-assessment and determine what the preference is for modes of exercise. For an athlete, it is very important to select activities that mimic, as closely as possible, the movement patterns employed in the competition. So, for example, you don't do speed skate or inline skating to train for a professional cyclist. That doesn't work. The movement patterns obviously do not transfer over from inline skating to cycling. So that's not the results will not be the same. So ultimately, you want to have a positive adaptation in specific physiological systems. Movement pattern is very important in driving that specific stimulus for the recruitment of specific muscle fibers and the adaptation of the energy systems within these fibers. Now let's discuss training frequency. So this is the number of training sessions conducted in a day and in a week. Okay, it's dependent on interaction of many different variables, including intensity, duration. The training status of your athlete will dictate how frequent they can train, and the specific sports season. So frequency may be higher in the off season and less in the competition season because you want to have more rest so you're fresh for competition. So some examples would be high intensity and long duration sessions may necessitate less frequent training to allow adequate recovery. So if you have a big training day where it has for an advanced elite athlete, they might have high intensity and long duration in a session, which means that you have less sessions per week to allow for adequate recovery between, so you get quality work. If you're doing a moderate intensity every single day, then you're going to have fatigue and the quality of the session will not be as good. So preseason frequency, 5 days per week versus specific preparation in the competition phase, which may be daily. So maintenance versus attainment of desired physiological function or performance will also dictate the frequency at which you prescribe exercise. So studies have shown increased injury rates with training sessions more frequent than 5 days per week for endurance training. So frequency is extremely important. So really there's a optimal amount of frequency. So too much training may induce risk of injury, illness, overtraining, and stagnant training adaptations and performance. So this is where you see like a flat line in performance or even a decrease in performance. And this may be due to too high training frequency with not enough rest to see the adaptations. As well, too little training will not result in positive adaptations to various systems of the body. So anything less than 2 days per week does not increase VO2 peak when it comes down to cardiovascular training. So this is where, when I was working with clients, I would make sure that they committed to at least 2 sessions with me per week or 2 sessions of individual training on their own per week. Because if it's less than that, you're not going to see any benefits. Most of the time, I would get them to sign up for at least 3 to 4 times per week and adhere to that training plan. And then we would scale it back and make it achievable and sustainable for them. Now let's discuss training frequency specific to elite endurance athletes. So training 2 sessions per day, every other day, may be needed to get the volume in for elite endurance athletes, specifically Ironman athletes and other multi-sport athletes. The caution to this is you must monitor the athlete for overtraining signs. So if they have poor quality sleep or the quantity isn't there, if they have appetite suppression, if they're chronically fatigued, if their resting heart rate is elevated over multiple days, these are signs of overtraining. And then we also have to consider recovery from individual training sessions is essential if the athlete is to derive max benefits from the subsequent training session. So this goes back to the old saying, less is sometimes more. And in this case, recovery is very important, that you need to recover. Remember the general adaptation syndrome. You have to provide recovery in order for adaptation to occur. If you don't provide recovery, then you're going to get in the decompensation stage where you actually see your immune system and your physiological systems are actually compromised as a result. So rest, hydration, restoration of fuel stores, and the psychological recovery is key. Now let's move into training intensity. So intensity is so important because this provides the stimulus for change. It is the predominant driver of adaptation. And this goes back to that general adaptation syndrome, that you need to have the onset of shock. And the onset of shock really comes from the training intensity that really shakes up the physiology, makes recruitment of different factors come into play so that you actually get stronger from it. So higher the intensity, the shorter the exercise duration or shorter the exercise volume. So there's this interplay between intensity and volume. When intensity is high, volume is lower. When volume, which could be exercise duration, is high, exercise intensity is low. And you want to manipulate these two variables to not induce too much fatigue. Elite athletes can handle a little bit higher intensity and high volume at the same time, but you need to ensure there's adequate recovery. So adaptations in physiology are specific to the intensity or effort during a training session. For example, exercise intensity increases means that there's greater recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers to meet the increased power needs. Those fibers become more aerobically trained, and it leads to possible improvements in aerobic performance. This is extremely important. So training intensity, the intensity that you're working out at will dictate the physiological change. So if you train slow, you will be slow. If you want to be fast, you need to train fast. So the intensity must mimic the competition demands for an athlete or mimic what the goal is for your client. For a general population individual, it may be just increasing the cardiovascular health to decrease disease risk. And so the intensity doesn't have to be that high. It can be just enough of a stimulus to see change. I gave you this figure before. It's that relationship between training intensity and improvement in VO2 max. So we have training intensity on the x-axis as a percent of VO2 max, and on the y-axis we have a percent improvement in VO2 max. So there is an optimal training intensity to get the biggest bang for your buck, which is training at between 80 to 100% of VO2 max. And this is where we start to see the greatest improvements in VO2 max, greater percent improvements at around 30%, 30 to 33% improvement in VO2 max with training. However, what is important to note of this figure, and I said this before in a previous lecture, that even at 40 to 60% VO2 max intensity, you still see improvements in VO2 max with training. So this holds promise for elderly and general population individuals who you're not getting to that high level intensity yet. And you may never get there, depending on their needs and their functional ability, etc. So this is important, that you are still seeing improvements in VO2 max of around 15 to 20% at 40 to 60% training intensity. as a percent of VO2 max. The caveat is that it will take longer to see changes. That if you're training at a lower percent training intensity, then it will just take longer to see changes, large changes in aerobic capacity. So how do we monitor training intensity, specifically for cardiovascular training? There's essentially 6 different ways you can do it. The first is a percentage of VO2 peak and the corresponding blood lactate concentration, which you need very specialized equipment for this. You need a metabolic cart and you need a blood lactate analyzer, which is out of reach for many people. The second one is heart rate, where you either manually determine it with your fingers at gauging your pulse at your wrist, or you can buy a watch that has integrated heart rate within it. The third type is rating of perceived exertion, which it can be used for anyone. That as long as you train your client on how to use the Borg scale, you can use RPE, which provides a valid indication of training intensity and internal load. The fourth is using METs, or your metabolic equivalent, which you've learned about in exercise physiology. The fifth is exercise velocity, so pace time, kilometers per hour, which is essentially your speed or your velocity over time, gives an indication of the intensity. And then power. So you can see it in the top right picture. It's a power control 7. This is what I used on my bike to give me an indication of the training intensity. And this was power, which was like in this picture, it says 237 watts with a corresponding heart rate of 154 beats per minute, plus your cadence, plus your speed. So there's multiple different metrics on that power control for an indication of the training intensity. So you have, for me, I always use watts or power on my bike, and then I also use heart rate as an indication of internal load. So there's multiple different ways that you can monitor training intensity. For a general population, I always just encourage RPE unless they have a heart rate monitor. And then if you want to be more specialized when you're working with elite populations of athletes, you would add in more training intensity monitoring tools to ensure that you're accurate at assessing internal load. I just wanted to show you a picture of a portable metabolic analyzer. This is one that I currently have in my lab, which, as you can see, it's portable, so you don't have to be in a lab setting. You could be in the field. The individual has the respiratory mask on, affixed to their head, and then the metabolic analyzer is on their back in a harness-based system. And this is where you can really get a gauge of the percent of VO2 peak and the volume of oxygen they're consuming, volume of carbon dioxide that they're exhaling in a given field-based exercise test or in their normal training to get a really good indication of the internal load placed on the body from the external load or the training prescription you've prescribed. And then on the right corner here, we have a blood lactate analyzer where you could take a finger prick. So you just prick the finger and get a little sample of capillary blood, and you put it on this little analyzer at the end of the lancet, and you can actually get an indication of their blood lactate concentration. So here on the screen, it says 2.3 millimoles. So that would be an indication of the exercise intensity. The higher the lactate number, the greater the flux through glycolysis and the more lactate that's being produced, giving you an indication that this exercise session is very much utilizing anaerobic glycolysis. Heart rate is considered to be the most frequently used method for prescribing intensity, especially now with Apple Watches and different watches having embedded heart rate. You need to be careful that that is actually measuring accurately. I remember having my first Fitbit and it had integrated heart rate and the heart rate was all over the place. So I always just put on the strap, which goes around your chest, to provide a better indication of heart rate that's linked to your watch as well. Heart rate is used because there is a close relationship between heart rate and the volume of oxygen consumed between 50 to 90% of VO2 max. So there's a tight correlation between these two variables, hence the reason why you can use heart rate to indicate what percent of VO2 max you're actually working at. But you need to determine the specific heart rate responses associated with your percent VO2 peak. And this is where if you have access to a lab and you can do a graded exercise test where you're directly measuring oxygen consumption and heart rate at the same time, Then you can accurately use heart rate as an indication of an individual's volume of oxygen consumed. But if testing is not available, you use age-predicted max heart rate, and you can use the Carvonian method and percent max heart rate methods. So this is heart rate reserve is a way that you can more accurately determine your heart rate training zones than just max heart rate alone. So as you can see up here on the top right, there's 5 heart rate training zones. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, but speed and power, anaerobic endurance, we have aerobic endurance, aerobic development, and then a warm-up recovery zones where you could use heart rate as prescriptive pieces and get the individual to record their heart rate as an indication of internal load. The next method of monitoring intensity is rating of perceived exertion, or RPE, using the Borg scale or a modified Borg scale. The figure that's on this screen is a modified Borg scale of 1 to 10. This is obviously modified from the 6 to 20 original Borg scale. What's been shown is that RPE is a valid subjective way to monitor intensity when there are changes in fitness level. The caveat to this is that your client needs to know how to properly use this chart, and with more familiarity and use of an RPE scale, the better they are at gauging their intensity. So there is a learning curve to this. And so you want to expose your client to it on multiple occasions so that they become aware of how to properly assess their internal responses to exercise. So RPE intensity relationship is influenced by various external environmental factors such as passive distractors and temperature. So heart rate, music is a passive distractor. Temperature and humidity within an environmental condition is a distractor as well and will influence RPE, because when you feel hotter, you feel that exercise is harder. So I mentioned that there is a learning curve to rating of perceived exertion. So you want to expose your client to the scale routinely so they become used to it and it becomes a valid indicator of internal load. As well, I use something called a sessional RPE where after each session, I ask my client, how do you rate that session on a scale of 1 to 10? Whether it was extremely little or easy, very easy, moderate, whatever it may be. And then I also have rated that session for my RPE of what I'm prescribing. So I might prescribe, say, that workout is actually a 7, but my client rates it after they've done the session and say it was a 3. Well, there's a disconnect between what I think I'm prescribing and what they're doing in the session. And so by doing sessional RPE, you can get a gauge of how your client responds to your external load prescription. And then you need to tailor that more. You need to change your prescription to ensure that they're getting the stimulus needed. Or it could be flipped, where they're giving you an RPE of 7, but you think you've made that workout to be a 3. And so there's a disconnect there too. So it helps by collecting sessional RPE information, both of yourself and the client. You can see whether there's any disconnects between what you're prescribing and what they're feeling. And this will help really refine your program design. So some people use power as an indication of intensity. This is more specific for cyclists. So when I raced, everything was based on power, and my prescription was entirely power determined. So I would do graded exercise tests and look at my peak power output and my mean power output for various tests, and then determine a percentage of that for my efforts for when I was training. So there is an advantage of using power over other measures because metabolic rate is closely related to mechanical power production. So that is very closely linked. It also allows for reproducibility of intensity efforts regardless of environmental conditions. So heart rate and RPE are susceptible to environmental conditions. So if it's hot outside, heart rate will be higher and your RPE will be higher. However, power is always the same. It's an absolute number. So in this case, it's not susceptible to other external factors, which is good, but you also have to be careful because if you're prescribing power, it doesn't doesn't change if an individual is sick or overtrained. Meanwhile, heart rate and RPE will typically be higher if an individual is sick and overtrained for the same relative exercise intensity. So power isn't more of an absolute measurement, and you need to typically link it with heart rate or RPE as well to get a better gauge of how the external environment and your own internal environment, whether you're sick or overtrained, etc., is impacting the intensity. Just a quick summary so far. So essentially, you want to ensure you choose an exercise mode that replicates the demands of the sport or the exercise in regards to movement patterns. The frequency of training is influenced by the intensity of training, the training status of your client, and the time of the training season. Intensity is the primary driver for physiological adaptations to exercise, and monitoring intensity is very important. There are multiple methods to track intensity of a session, and you need to pick at least one of them and use it as you're tracking the internal load of your client. Ideally, you want to have multiple different intensity measures, but at the same time, if you only have RPE, that's good, but there is a learning curve to it, so you want to ensure that you provide that many times so your client gets used to rating their own intensity level. Okay, now let's move into the fourth characteristic, which is exercise duration. So this is really defined as the length of time of the training session, and it's influenced really by exercise intensity. The longer the session, typically the lower the intensity. So for example, if the training session, if the quality of the work is greater than 85% of VO2 peak, this will have relatively short duration effort, so 20 to 30 minutes of effort, due to the accumulation of acidity within the muscle, which contributes to fatigue. For example, if a training session is performed at a lower intensity, less than 70% of your max, it may be performed for several hours before the athlete is fatigued. So there's this interplay that duration, or the time of exercise, the length of time of exercise, is really dictated by the intensity that you're doing the exercise. It makes sense. You can't hold a high intensity for a long period of time, but you can hold a low intensity for a long period of time. So you manipulate those two variables, volume and intensity. So now let's move into discussing our fifth component, which is exercise progression. I have three things I want to discuss here. The first one is that FIT, frequency, intensity, and time or duration, should not exceed an increase of greater than 10% each week. So say, for example, the time of training is 10 hours per week. You would not want to exceed an extra hour for week 2. So say you have 10 hours for week 1. Week 2 should not exceed 11 hours of training. And this is this progressive overload. You do not want to induce too much fatigue off the bat. So it's better to start slow and ensure that you're not fatiguing your athlete or your client for that matter. Instead, you're working towards a progressive overload to achieve their goals. Number 2, you want at least one recovery or active rest day per week of training. I always said I liked 2. I would do 3 days really hard, or 3 days of good quality training, and 1 day recovery. So I was on a 3-1 split, 3-to-1 split. It's up to you. It depends. I was an elite athlete, so in this case, 3-to-1 worked for me, so that I had 3 days of hard training psychologically. I would have 1 day, which I considered my grow day, where I didn't do hardly anything. I would walk and just recover and eat well. And then I knew the subsequent day was going to be a good quality day because I was recovered and I was eager to train again. So this is an issue that many recreational athletes and elite athletes have this mentality that they need to train every single day, otherwise they won't get any better. Well, actually, if you're training every single day, then you can get into something called monotony of training, where you're doing everything at a moderate intensity, that you're not reaching the high intensity that you need to see change and to create the stimulus for change. And so you get this monotony of training, which for some recreational exercisers, it's all about maintenance of the acquired benefits. And in this case, they are maintaining. But for an individual who wants to improve, you have to get the intensity and the quality work there, which may need a rest day. And in my case, as an elite athlete, I needed rest days in order for the day after the rest day to be really good quality and create a stimulus for change. Lastly, progression of exercise intensity should be monitored very closely to avoid overtraining. So intensity is the best measurement to assess exercise progression. That endurance athletes may not be able to increase frequency or duration more. They may be at their max for how many days per week they train. They may be at their max for the time that they train. So progressions in intensity will need to occur. So this slide provides a few simple examples of aerobic exercise progression. We have example A. You can see week 1 has a frequency of 4 times per week at an intensity of 70 to 85% of target heart rate, THR, for 40 minutes. Week 2, we increase the frequency to 5 times per week at the same intensity and a small increase in the minutes, the duration. Week 3, now we're back down to the frequency is only 3 times per week at an intensity of 70 to 85% of target heart rate for 40 minutes, and 1 time per week for 50 minutes. Okay, so we're increasing the volume, increasing the duration of exercise per 1 day per week. But remember, we increase the duration to 50 minutes, but we're lowering the intensity. Week 4 is 4 times per week at an intensity of 70 to 85% for 45 minutes, and 1 time per week for 50 minutes at a lower intensity. Okay, and then week 5, we go to 4 times per week at the same intensity they've been doing, same time they've been doing, and add in a longer duration day, so 55 minutes at 60 to 75%. This is a good example of that progression where you're manipulating fit, frequency, intensity, and time, but not overdoing it. Okay, we have a tendency when we create plans to overdo it. I overdid it for my first client, and they could hardly walk for a week. And I was thankful that she actually came back to me. But that was a learning lesson when I was 18, that I would never do that again. Don't train someone with what you think you can handle. Okay, you have to start easy and progressively overload. Learn from my mistakes. So example B, week 1, 3 times per week, 4 times per week, week 2, manipulating volume, intensity, and time, frequency, all of those factors, the fit principles. Okay, so just look at these examples to help you in how you're prescribing exercise for your mom and dad, for your relatives, for your clients that you may have. Just a little reminder to prescribe recovery. And for a lot of clients, it's so important that they hear you say that they can recover. So sleep is so important, the quality and quantity of sleep, making sure you're stretching and having some active recovery and getting therapy if needed.